Hi everybody, this is Morihiko Nakahara joining you again from the gallery here at the Koga Center for the Arts in Columbia, South Carolina. And here we are going to be talking about our fifth Masterworks concert for this season, which is entitled One Night with Juan. The concert then naturally includes the famous symphonic poem Don Juan by Richard Strauss, as well as the South Carolina premiere of Cold Mountain Suite by American composer Jennifer Higdon. And then in the second half, the noted pianist Alessio Bax returns to Columbia to join the orchestra in the massive Piano Concerto No. 2 by Johannes Brahms. So Brahms and Strauss, their lives and their careers overlapped quite a bit. Strauss wrote Don Juan, started working on it in 1888, and Brahms was still working and living at that time. But these two kind of come from the polar opposites in terms of what we could call like musical aesthetics. Brahms was very much more in the extension, in a way, of the German musical tradition that kind of dates back to, in some ways, Bach, but also specifically Beethoven as well. When young Brahms first came onto the scene, the noted other composers and critics sort of dubbed Brahms as, oh, here comes finally our next Beethoven. And that sort of became a blessing and a curse for Brahms. As a result, he just could not bear to write a symphony, or he started working on a symphony, and it would quickly be sort of overcome by this emotional burden or pressure to create something that would be worthy of being the successor to Beethoven's symphonies, especially in Brahms's time. People are always looking for, well, what is this next Beethoven going to do? And of course, the measuring stick was going to be, what is Brahms's symphony going to sound like? And Brahms just couldn't bear that burden. So early in his career, he would start working on a large-scale orchestral work in hopes that that will turn into a symphony. And quickly, eventually, it would kind of become something else. And one of those pieces was his first piano concerto, which predates the second piano concerto by about 20 years. And in that concerto, and incidentally, when the last time Alessio Bax was here to play with the South Carolina Philharmonic, he played the first piano concerto of Brahms. And this was several years ago. And I had known Alessio before that, but after doing the first concerto together here, we sort of made not a pinky promise, but we agreed, okay, we need to do this again, but we need to do the second concerto by Brahms. So many years later, I'm glad that we are actually finally bringing that to fruition here and have Alessio join us to play the second concerto by Brahms. But the first piano concerto, the public perception or reception of that piece was almost uniformly negative. And so Brahms, as a result, and he was a pianist, that was his main instrument. He performed a lot, premiered a lot of his compositions throughout his career, solo piano works, chamber music, and so on. And so it would be natural that he would be writing more works featuring piano as a solo instrument with orchestra, so these piano concertos. He only wrote 2, and it took him 20 years to write the second one. And I think he was there was a bit of PTSD from the disastrous reception or the premiere of the first piano concerto. So it took him basically 20 years to come back to the genre of piano concerto. And when he did come back, though, he gave us essentially a 4-movement, it's basically like a 4-movement symphony with solo piano part. And that's how one of the most famous music critics at the time sort of dubbed this concerto as a symphony with a piano obbligato part. So basically saying it's basically structured like a full-scale symphonic work with piano carrying the piano acting as a soloist, but almost within the fabric of a symphony orchestra. type of thing. I mentioned it's in 4 movements, so again, it's a little bit, structurally speaking, 4 movements is very typical of a symphony, but when you look at many of the famous and popular concertos featuring solo instruments, they tend to be in 3 movements a lot of the times. So here he actually adds as a movement to turn it into a 4-movement scheme. The first movement is this huge grand scale symphonic movement, except it starts out with a horn solo, just like a gentle horn melody, and piano answers gently. And right after the beginning, he actually puts a huge cadenza for the piano. Oftentimes these cadenzas are like the unaccompanied solo, extended solo passage. Usually, traditionally would occur towards the end of the first movement. If you look at all the concertos, let's say piano concertos by Mozart or Beethoven, traditionally speaking, the cadenza happens at the end of the first movement. But here, Brahms kind of flips the proceedings, has the cadenza towards the beginning of it, and out of that sort of starts that bridges into the main portion of the first movement. The second movement is a scherzo movement, which was not usually included in a concerto format, but here he includes the scherzo movement. It's a very lively, bold sounding movement. Then follows the third movement is the slow movement, the andante movement. And in this movement, the main idea at the beginning of the movement is actually introduced by solo cello. And this solo cello line plays a critical role in the slow movement, even more so than the piano itself. It's really more about the cello. The opening is similar in a way to Brahms's violin concerto, which he was working. It's from the similar time frame as this second piano concerto. The slow movement of the violin concerto opens with an extended oboe solo line for oboe, and in this case, with the piano concerto, it's given to the cello. And then the fourth movement, after all of this 3 movements passing by, the fourth movement, it's not really. The finale is not quite as one would say, like, not as bombastic or even celebratory in a way. It's the movement is actually called Allegretto Grazioso. So from the Grazioso that title suggests, it is a very graceful movement. It is very optimistic. And in the middle, you can hear Brahms's also kind of lifelong fascination with the music of the Romani tradition, which people who are familiar with his Hungarian dances, you know that he was very much into that style of music, sort of the fiddling type of sound. And so there's a little bit of that episode included in the finale of this. But otherwise, it is a very graceful, optimistic movement that concludes this mammoth. Basically, this at the time was probably one of the longest concertos that was ever written. Basically lasts for almost 50 minutes. So it is like a grand symphony in terms of its scope and length, and that's why we're featuring it actually in the second half of the program, because of its sheer scope and size of it. Brahms would often write about his music as he's like working, as he's working through, is in the process of composing things. He would often write about what he's been working on to his friends, to his publishers, and so on. As he got later in life, into like this period, he started doing this weird, annoying habit of describing. So bigger the piece, he would actually preface it or prep it as though he was working on something very tiny. So he kept on referring to this concerto as this little miniature thing with this like mini scherzo in it. And he would keep on doing that about all his works. Last season we performed one of his later works, the Fourth Symphony. When he was working on his Fourth Symphony, he would refer it to as, oh, it's just a bunch of polkas and waltzes, which is not, it's really pretty far from the truth. So here again, I don't know what I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know what it was like a little joke he was playing, or was it his lack of self-confidence? I have no idea. But generally, larger the scale of the work, as was the case with this piece, he would refer to it as something that was very insignificant and tiny. So that's how he would describe it. But one thing that would show his comfort level or confidence or his belief in this particular piece is the fact that he dedicated this piece to his very first composition teacher. And this was basically the first piece that he would ever do that. So it's sort of that you can see his psyche, where he now feels comfortable, or he feels like he's now a mature enough composer as a composer to now be able to dedicate a major piece of work like a piano concerto to his very first composition teacher from his childhood. Also, this was Brahms himself. He played a solo part at the premiere as well. It was premiered in 1889, and he was the soloist. It's kind of interesting because a few years before this, he sort of publicly swore off performing as a pianist in public anymore. He said he was just going to basically focus as a composer. He wasn't going to conduct. He wasn't going to play piano in public. But with this particular piece, he decided he really wanted to bring it to life himself as a pianist. So that's what happened. Incidentally, and it's just a coincidence, but in April we are doing Mahler's First Symphony. Mahler's First Symphony was premiered 9 days after the first piece you're here on the program, which is Richard Strauss's Don Juan. And it's kind of interesting if you are coming to both, and I would urge you to come to both this March concert and the Mahler concert in April, but to kind of compare the two pieces you will hear over the span of two concerts. So this brings us to sort of the musical polar opposite of Brahms. So Brahms, at least in his symphonic works, his instrumental works, he tended to stay away from what we call program music. By that I mean music that has like some kind of extra musical references, telling a particular story or musical depiction of a character, historical figure or fictitious character, and so on. Brahms was more of a traditionalist, so he was sort of considered polar opposite of people like Wagner, or Richard Strauss or Franz Liszt, who would often write pieces with a specific programmatic association to it. And so much so that in the case of Strauss, he felt that the styles embodied by people like Brahms was very much outdated. And Strauss felt that the new path was his way of doing things, which is interesting because when he was younger, and he wrote Don Juan in his early 20s, but he was very much a prodigy. When we think of prodigy, we think of people like Mozart or Mendelssohn. But Richard Strauss, he was also a musical prodigy, and he was composing things in his early teen years as well. These are pieces that we still perform today. Well, some of these pieces, at least, from his teen years. And his father was his father Franz Strauss was a famous horn player. And so, but then his father apparently was very much more conservative in his musical taste. So he was probably more of the Camp Brahms kind of a guy. And Richard Strauss's early works kind of show that influence. So you could tell he was very much influenced by earlier composers, past composers, Mozart, Mendelssohn, and so on. But as he approached his late teen years and into his early 20s, he kind of made this radical shift in his the way he was writing, and also the type of music that he was writing. So in his early 20s now, Don Juan, Till Eulenspiegel, all of these pieces, we call them symphonic poems. So definitely they are musical storytelling in a way, as opposed to more abstract pieces that he was writing in his childhood. Now he's writing in the manner similar to Franz Liszt or Smetana, who wrote the famous Moldau, and so on. Strauss kind of established himself as a serious composer in his early 20s through a series of these symphonic poems, like Don Juan. Of course, the story of Don Juan, many of you are familiar with the story of Don Juan, which some versions of this story of Don Juan essentially dates back to the 16th century. But for this particular piece, Strauss found a poem by an Austrian poet and philosopher, Linau, who wrote his version of Don Juan. And in the score, in the music, the first edition of the score quotes passages from Linau's adaptations or his telling of Don Juan's story. And what makes this one interesting is that because Linau comes from because he was a poet, but he was also a noted philosopher. So his version of Don Juan is really, he's doing all these things just in search of what he only wants to find one true love. And so he's in pursuit of one true love, which he realizes he cannot find. When he realizes that he probably will never be able to find his one true love, he basically gives up hope. There's a great quote from the poem itself. I'm going to read it here. So in the end of this prose, then, when he realizes that he can't find his eternal love, is when soon after that he finds himself in a duel, and basically he allows himself to be killed in a duel. He basically doesn't even try, and you can kind of hear that ending. All of a sudden, like it's almost like this balloon just like deflates after all of these bold musical gestures that you think is leading towards a very triumphant or blazing conclusion. It just kind of, the bottom drops out a little bit with the energy, and you can tell musically there's a tragedy happening, and then the music just ends very quietly, which is kind of unexpected ending for what comes before that all the way through. But the quote by the poet that Strauss used for the ending is, "My deadly foe is in my power, and this too bores me, as does life itself." And he utters these words before he basically allows himself to be stabbed and dies. So he was very much touched by that element of it. So he wanted to keep that part of the story in this music. So that kind of explains the ending of it a little bit. Strauss was also, when he was, like many people, Mahler later in the season as well. Strauss was kind of working on a dual career around this time of his career in his early 20s, both as a conductor and composer. So as he was writing this in 1888 into 1889, he had a new conducting gig in the city of Weimar as the assistant conductor for that city's opera house. So he got to conduct the premiere of this himself in November of 1889. It pretty much scandalized a lot of audience members because they weren't I guess they weren't as used to at the time hearing such vivid musical depictions of things, and the whole storyline apparently kind of offended some audience members. Now it's just become a staple of symphonic repertoire, and when we describe Strauss, Richard Strauss, as a composer, if you mention the name Strauss, or if you mention Don Juan by Strauss, or Till Eulenspiegel, or Ein Heldenleben, all of these big symphonic poems by Strauss, to my musician colleagues, you would either be met with, well, what it is that a lot of musicians would agree that Strauss's writing for each instrument, strings in particular, but for each instrument, is very much virtuosic. That the technical demands are very high. So it's not easy to play music by Strauss, but they all enjoy the challenge of it. And that's sort of the hallmark of Strauss's writing. And he was writing this kind of music as a young man. So we always think of him as this kind of precocious prodigy who would toss in all these very demanding and most virtuosic passages for various instruments in the orchestra. So it becomes a huge showpiece for any orchestra as well. So I'm looking forward to tackling on this challenge with my colleagues in the South Carolina Philharmonic to bring this piece and to bring the story of Don Juan as described by Linao to life on this concert. Concert also includes a very much compared to the pieces now dating from the end of the 19th century, we're very much in the current time. And we are happy to be part of almost 40 orchestras from around the country to be presenting the piece you're going to hear on this concert, and that is the Cold Mountain Suite by American composer Jennifer Higdon. Jennifer Higdon was commissioned to write this. There's an organization called New Music for America, and essentially their goal was to get at least one orchestra from each state in the country to participate and pool the commission fees together to commission a major piece of work from a very much a leading composer, somebody like Jennifer Higdon, then in turn would be performed by all of these orchestras around the country. So this piece was just premiered officially, I think, this past fall, I believe in Delaware or somewhere, and now it's making the rounds throughout the country. And so we, along, I believe, with the Long Bay Symphony, which is in Myrtle Beach, are the sort of the South Carolina participants or South Carolina representatives for this project. Jennifer Higdon, she actually grew up in parts of Tennessee, sort of very close to the Smoky Mountains. So she felt very close to the story of Cold Mountain, which is based on a novel by Charles Frazier. And it was turned into a big film several years ago as well, featuring Nicole Kidman, Renée Zellweger, and Jude Law, and so on. And so Higdon actually started out working on Cold Mountain. It was her first opera, and it was a commission by the Santa Fe Opera back in 2015. What we are presenting is her orchestral suite. She created a new 15-minute orchestral highlights, if you would, from her opera. and so that's what you'll be hearing on this program. Higdon said when she got her commission from Santa Fe Opera, and it was going to be, as I mentioned, her first opera, and so she really wanted to get this one right, being a major commission, first opera. So she said she went through about over 100 different stories, books, and so on, trying to decide on the subject matter to turn it into an opera. And she says she came upon the book, the Fraser book, Cold Mountain. And she says she actually had never read it before this. But as she started reading it, and she talks about how at least in the first edition of the book, I guess, when you open the book, there's actually a map of where the story takes place. And then she realized that, where Cold Mountain is, and there's a whole, like on the map, you could see it kind of leads into Smoky Mountains and leads into where sort of the family farm in this little town in Tennessee, where she basically spent half of her childhood while she was growing up. And so she immediately felt like she could, as she was turning the pages, as she was going through this book, she said she felt like she could tell the story, and she kind of understood the pacing of it, the characters, the people, the landscape, all of this whole setting of it, that she felt like she could bring it to life and do full justice, because it was the same kind of sights and sounds that she remembered as a kid growing up in Tennessee. So she turned it into an opera, and whenever somebody creating an opera, sometimes based on a book, let's say, for those of you who are film fans or fans of major TV shows, TV series, or films, a lot of times when you go to these big awards like the Academy Awards, there will be a category for adapted screenplay, and sometimes that does happen, right? When there's a famous book that gets turned into a film, well, somebody still has to write the screenplay. And sometimes in the process of this, and this sometimes becomes a hot topic, because the fans of the original novel, let's say, sometimes they don't really like the film version adaptation of it, because they feel like they changed the story, or maybe they added a character that wasn't in the original book to kind of tell the story in a different way, or a more effective way as it happens on the screen. And same kind of process happens for opera when it's based on a book. So Higdon, in turning this book into an opera, she worked with what we call librettist. So librettist essentially is it's like basically a screenwriter or screenplay creator for the film. Librettist does that for opera. So in working with her librettist, they decided that in the original book, what was missing was the perspective of the slaves during the Civil War. So they decided. So there's a new character who is sort of a major character in the opera, who is not in the book. And so her name is Lucinda, and Lucinda is a slave girl who then has to decide her own relationship with one of the main characters as the war goes on, as the story continues. So that was one of the, I guess, tweaks, if you would, that Higdon made to the story. The opera itself was premiered in 2015, and she became the first American composer to win International Opera Award for that year, which is given to the best new opera written in that year. And so she won that. And then it's been now being revived by other companies, opera companies throughout the U.S. and throughout the world. It has become one of the most popular English operas created in the last few decades now. And so we're very excited to bring sort of the orchestral highlights from this opera. Higdon's writing, and we've done a few pieces by Higdon here, and I've done a few of her other pieces with other orchestras. There's a very much a rhythmic, well, you would expect sort of from a 20th and 21st century American composer, which is a very vital, the sense of rhythmic vitality, the sense of abandon and energy that comes out in this music. But at the same time, Higdon also has such a beautiful lyrical writing that she always incorporates in her music. And so there are the central section of this suite from Cold Mountain. You will hear this very tender, kind of almost reminiscent of some of the open soundscape of Aaron Copland from several decades ago. But this sense of lyricism and openness that kind of comes through in her writing as well. I'm going to close this, and I'm going to read another quote again. But this one comes from Jennifer Higdon, and it kind of, to me, it embodies sort of as South Carolina Philharmonic our approach to music, presenting music to our audiences, and it just kind of really resonated with me. So I'm going to close out by reading this quote. This is by Jennifer Higdon, and she said, I just want audience members to sit back and enjoy my music. I hope it makes them feel something, but I don't ever want anyone to feel that they must be knowledgeable about classical music to enjoy mine. If you find yourself patting your foot, wanting to cry, or humming a bit after the concert, then I've done my job. So that's close out with that, and hope you enjoy the concert.